Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to stop by and visit us, you can find us at 5600 Van Road at 9 a.m. on Sundays for Bible study, 10 a.m. for worship, 4 p.m. for another worship period in the afternoon, and also at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for a Bible study. We would love to have you join us for any and all of those. If you have comments or questions or concerns or a topic to suggest for a future TV program, then feel free to get those to us via the phone at 812-550-6234 or over email info@riverridgechurch.org. We would love to hear from you. The title of today's program is Don't Give Up on Salome. This is taken from a recent Wednesday night class that we had here at River Ridge, and it was so deep and moving in some ways that we stuck with it, and it spilled over into our Sunday class, even though we had other things on the schedule for that day. And then it also spilled over into the sermon for that morning, and now here I am sharing it with you. Salome. It's not as if I have never studied the text about this girl before, but as I get older and more perceptive and gain more experience, things like the story that we're going to discuss today hit me much harder than they used to. Let me give you the short version of the story before we start. Herod, who was the tetrarch, more or less the king, although that wasn't his official title, the tetrarch of Galilee and another small region in that area, got irritated with John the Baptist because John the Baptist, being God's prophet, had the nerve to point out that Herod's marriage wasn't valid before God. He tried to silence John by just putting him in prison, but in the long run, that wasn't enough to make everyone happy, so Herod had him killed. Okay, now that you know where we're starting and where this is going to eventually go, let's take a deeper look at the text and focus on one person I didn't even have to mention in order to tell the basic story, and consider her part in what happened to John the Baptist. We will set the stage, and then we will consider the layers of evil in Herod's household, probably think harder about this one individual than you otherwise would have, and I hope come away with a surprising lesson that applies to all of us today. Let's set the stage. In Mark chapter 6, we'll begin in verse 16. But when Herod heard of it, that means Jesus' reputation, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For it was Herod who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. So Mark tells us the ending first. And it's not that he's a rube. He's a good author. He knows what he's doing, and he did this for a reason. He's trying to pique our interest, saying John is going to be beheaded at the end of the story. Okay, now let's discuss how did this happen. Jesus' name has become increasingly known throughout Galilee by this time because of his ministry and his miracles and his healings and that sort of thing. Even the powerful elite are aware of him, as evidenced by Herod learning about him and thinking that it must be John the Baptist. Now, that response may seem a bit odd to us. He just leaps to the conclusion that John has risen from the dead. Have you ever seen something quite like that before, Herod? Well, in his defense, there were a lot of miracles being performed by Jesus, and these were things that were obviously supernatural. There were a lot of people who were demon-possessed at that time, so there's a flavor of the supernatural already about, and they're all aware of this. By the way, at least 2 people have been raised from the dead by now, by Jesus. One was the widow's son in the village of Nain. You can find that in Luke chapter 7, beginning in about verse 11. The second one was the daughter of Jairus, who just before this story in Mark at the end of chapter 5. Herod is clearly not a righteous, God-fearing man, but between what has been going on and perhaps a bit of superstition on his part, it seems like a fairly reasonable conclusion that John the Baptist could have been raised. And let's not forget, since Herod is the one behind John's death, he's feeling guilty. And when he suspects that John has risen from the dead, he's not joyous about this. If anything, we get sort of a sense of dread from him, that maybe he's going to have to pay for what he knows he has done wrong. Okay, how did this come about, we might ask? Let's get into the setting. We read about the broken marriage that led up to all of this. We've got Herod and Herod's brother Philip, and Herod's brother is married to a woman named Herodias. Well, Herodias leaves him and runs off with her brother-in-law. So this is a grotesque violation of the law of Moses. Leviticus 18:16 says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness." While we're at it, we could throw in verse 14, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. That is, you shall not approach his wife. She is your aunt." And we have to flip the genders from aunt to uncle, but Herod is actually Herodias's half-uncle. The names may have been a hint that they were related, as well as Herodias being Herod's sister-in-law. So they've started by committing adultery because Herodias' marriage to Philip is still valid in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the law, and somehow they're making it worse by getting into these incestuous relationships. With all of that said, they're not on the same page regarding what to do about John. And this bodes poorly for all involved. We also might notice that Herod doesn't have much of a spine. Here he is, he's basically the king, and he is afraid to kill John. He's afraid of the people, and I suppose to a lesser extent he's afraid of God. He's also afraid to let John go. Here he's afraid of his wife, niece, sister-in-law, lover, Herodias. He's also unwilling to heed John's teaching and just clean himself up. So it's as if he's got three somewhat valid courses of action here, depending on your perspective, and he is not willing to take any of them. And yet, verse 21, we read, "An opportunity came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet." An opportunity. An opportunity for Herod? No. To be clear, this is an opportunity for Herodias to get what she wants, despite Herod's inaction. Herod is not actually the primary villain of this story. Okay, so this takes place at a birthday party. There are actually only two such birthday parties mentioned in the Bible. There's this one, and then there's the birthday party of Pharaoh in Egypt way back in Genesis. That was the occasion on which he ended up throwing his chief cupbearer and chief baker in prison. We don't know exactly why. It's not that birthday celebrations are a problem, but it is kind of funny that those are the only two birthday parties that we read about in the Bible, and they both end up pretty poorly, and they don't reflect well on the birthday boy. The reason that it's even brought up at all is that normal people in these cultures and in these periods didn't have time or leisure for this kind of self-centered decadence and debauchery, depending on the party. Who attends this party? The rich and the powerful. These are mostly immoral people. And what's going to happen at the party? Do you think it's going to be a night of raucous board games? No, probably not. It's more like drunkenness and the most dazzling entertainment that was available to them, all sorts of decadence and self-gratification. Nothing good is going to come from this behavior. So we've got a deeply immoral man in a deeply immoral setting. Now let's read about the dance. Verse 22. "For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, 'Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you.' And he vowed to her, 'Whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half my kingdom.'" So what kind of dance do you think this is? Probably a tap dance, huh? Well, maybe not. Considering the setting and considering the people involved, and considering the effect that it obviously had on Herod based on his incredibly ridiculous response, this dance was extremely unwholesome. We don't know this girl's age, but a couple of things. First, girls were typically married off soon after they reached puberty. For the poor, they were eager to have one less mouth to feed. And for the wealthy and powerful, like in this family, they were eager to cement alliances. For example, this girl's mother, Herodias, was engaged to be married at roughly age 8. We don't know exactly when that marriage took place, but still, 8. On top of that, the word that Mark chooses to describe Herodias' daughter is korasion, which translates literally to little young woman. Now, that could include a wide range of ages, but for some context, in just the previous chapter, both Mark and Jesus describe Jairus' daughter as a korasion, a little young woman, and Mark tells us in verse 42 of chapter 5 that this girl was about 12. Who is this girl? She's just called Herodias' daughter, which makes her Herod's stepdaughter, but also his niece, because that makes her the daughter of Herod's brother Philip. It also makes her his great niece because she's the daughter of his half-niece Herodias. This just gets creepier and creepier. And just consider for a moment, but perhaps not too deeply, the way that she is presenting herself before her stepdad and uncle and great-uncle. Now we could also throw in Leviticus 18:17, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and of her daughter." So that gets added to the list of forbidden sexual relationships under the law of Moses. We don't know that it actually went to that extent, but that's obviously what was in Herod's heart. Why do you think he made this ridiculous vow? Yeah, I'm sure he's probably drunk. That plays into it. But it's also hormones behind this. In some part of the back of his mind, even if he wouldn't bring it to the conscious forefront, in some part of the back of his mind, he's thinking, if I give this girl whatever she asks for, then maybe... Ugh. Let's read about the result, as Mark foretold it at the beginning of the story. Verse 24. "Then she went out and said to her mother, 'For what should I ask?' And she said, 'The head of John the Baptist.' She came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, 'I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter.' And the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. And immediately the king sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl. The girl gave it to her mother." I've read this story many times over many years, and maybe you have too. It had lost its power to shock me. How about you? Even if it's completely new to you, it may seem like just another story that ends in death, and that's the only thing worth remembering. But try to empathize here. Try to imagine yourself as perhaps one of the guests at that party. Not that you would have any business attending that party, but we all make bad decisions sometimes. Try to visualize this scene from that perspective. Maybe this helps a little. This was painted by Mariano Salvador Maella when he was just 22 years old. He's not a very well-known artist today, but he actually worked alongside Goya as one of the primary painters of the Spanish court in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. There are numerous paintings out there portraying Salome, and this scene particularly, but I like this painting the best for a handful of reasons. One of the reasons is that Maella made at least some attempt at a sort of Eastern style of dress. A lot of the others are hilariously European Baroque looking. Another reason is that, unlike most of the other artists who have depicted this scene in various media over the centuries, Maella didn't seek to capitalize on the titillating nature of the story. In short, he painted Salome fully clothed and not in some seductively suggestive pose. I'm not a proponent of totally prudish art. If it doesn't reflect reality, it isn't any good, which is why most overtly Christian movies, for example, just aren't very good movies. Christians are, quite rightly, hesitant to showcase sin, or even to portray a relatable bad guy. But in reality, sin is everywhere, and bad guys are extremely relatable. I know, I'm related to a few. And beyond that, I can relate very easily to man's evil choices, because I've made quite a few of those evil choices myself. But back to Salome, and why I picked this painting. A, it's a lot easier for me to share worthwhile art when I don't have to worry about where's the line between art and pornography, and B, it makes it much easier to focus on what's really so unsettling about the story depicted, because we're all focusing on the faces in the painting, as we should be in the first place, but often get distracted. Look at that face. It's very youthful, immature. It's free from worries, from stress, from the wrinkles that come from time and experience. In the absence of the severed head in her hands, we might have said she looks innocent. As we read in Mark, the faceless, nameless daughter of Herodias seems like she's not all that active a part of the story. But we do know her name from the Jewish historian Josephus. It was Salome. And now we can imagine her face. I have also pointed out her probable age, and this is reflected in the painting. I have pointed out her relationship to the man offering her whatever she wants, and I've pointed out her hopelessly broken and dysfunctional family situation. This girl was placed, through no fault of her own, into a terrible situation. She still should have known better than to participate in killing John. Salome does bear part of the guilt for his murder. But, and this is the important part of the story that we usually fail to recognize, Salome is also a victim of the real villains, Herod and Herodias. Her hands aren't clean, but whose guilt is worse? The girl who did what her mother told her? Or the mother who sent her daughter to prostitute herself before a crowd of lecherous creeps and then used their perverted lust to further her own vendetta? What about the man who let his passion toward his actual niece and stepdaughter drive him to carry out a murder he didn't particularly want to commit, all things being equal? Mark didn't even name her, but throughout history Salome has been cast as the main villain in this story, because her part in the story is so titillating, which is to say, because the audience today are creeps just like the audience at Herod's birthday party were creeps. The people who were supposed to care for her and protect her encouraged her to debase herself before predators and get involved in a vengeful murder. The proper order is for father and mother to instill virtues in their children. These jerks flipped that on its head, didn't they? They replaced it with a twisted system of morals based on lust and power. Salome did wrong, but she's nowhere near as culpable as her creepy, hateful, adulterous, and murderous mother, or as her creepy, spineless, adulterous, and lecherous uncle. But the worst part isn't that she's a victim too. The worst part is that in spite of that, she is guilty too. She might not have been completely accountable for her actions, but she's old enough to know right from wrong if she's old enough to arouse this man's passions. And there's nothing in the story that would suggest she's not mentally capable. In Matthew 18, Jesus says, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea." Why does Jesus take this so personally? It's because these kids are so vulnerable. They're not only vulnerable to physical and mental and emotional harm, but to spiritual harm. When someone abuses a child, like Herod and Herodias have done here, they're damaging someone who hasn't yet damaged herself, and they're making it harder for her to find redemption in the long run. In James chapter 3, verse 1 says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." Why should that be? Because when you lead others astray, they will get hurt. Not just a stubbed toe or a crippling emotional anxiety for life, but a rift between them and God that is partly your fault. Where does that lead if it's unchecked? It leads to hell. They'll get a taste of it on earth, and it will be so much worse after that. If you're the one responsible for starting an innocent down that path, it's not just on them, it's on you too. When an adult decides to take a young, innocent, impressionable mind and twist it for his or her own pleasure, where does it usually lead the kid? It leads the kid to a life of things like violence and drug use and broken relationships and prostitution. And what happens to the next generation? They will most likely either be killed in the womb as a modern-day sacrifice to Molech, or treated in exactly the same way as the first child was, leading to the same life of sin and despair, to echo through the generations. The doctrine of original sin is false. I've discussed that before on the show. We don't have time to really get into it today, but as it's commonly understood, meaning the notion of inherited guilt from Adam and Eve, that is false. It's not in the Bible. You stand condemned before God because of your own sin, not because of great-grandpa's sins. But that notion is so prevalent and so enduring because it gets at something real. You're not responsible for the sins of your parents, but you're incredibly likely to repeat them. Is there any hope? Of course there is, through Jesus, for everyone. But what about for Salome specifically? The parallel passage, Luke chapter 6, verse 9, tells us that shortly after John's execution, Herod sought to see Jesus. Remember, he kind of thought Jesus must be John come back to life. Maybe Salome heard him talking about this powerful prophet and his resemblance to John, whom she had helped him to murder. Herod got his wish in Luke 23. Just before Jesus' crucifixion, he got to see Jesus. Maybe Salome was somewhere in the shadows observing that conversation. Maybe she even got to interact with Jesus. John tells us twice in the Gospel, at the end of chapter 20 and at the end of chapter 21, that there's just too much to write down every detail. I suppose we probably could have figured that out for ourselves, but it's a valid point. We don't know all of the details. And then there's Mark chapter 15, beginning in verse 40. At the foot of Jesus' cross, there were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him, and there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. To top that off, after Jesus is dead and buried in chapter 16, verse 1, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. Could it be? Mark didn't give her name before, but he mentions this name for the first time, just like he does with Mary Magdalene, in the same stroke of the pen, as if everyone knows who she is. Salome, like Mary, was a common name. It means peace, as in Shalom and Jerusalem, and also it was a family name among the Herods. There are several women who wore this name Salome just within a few generations of that family, much like the numerous men who wore the name Herod, so that it's sometimes tough to tell which is which. Is this our Salome, then? At the cross and at the tomb? If I had to guess, no. This probably isn't her. But why couldn't it be? Is that poor, horrible girl irredeemable? No, it is possible. Even if it wasn't her at the cross and at the tomb, and I think it probably was another of the many thousands of ladies who happened to share that name at that time and in that area, even if it's not her, should we write her off so early in her life? Now, Jeremy, you'll say, this wasn't exactly a normal youthful indiscretion. She paraded herself around before her uncle and his creepy friends, and then used the influence that gained her to have a righteous man of God murdered. Yeah, I know. And the Apostle Paul persecuted the church and participated in the killing of Stephen. King David took advantage of his wife's friend, and then had his friend killed when he couldn't hide effectively the pregnancy that resulted from that union. King Manasseh consorted with witches and offered up his own children in the fire to Molech. They all repented. They all found redemption. To top that off, I'm only 32, and I had a fairly sheltered upbringing. Yet I've known multiple people whose stories aren't that different from what we know of Salome's story. The ugly truth is that her behavior was actually, in some sense, normal. In the absence of a father and mother instilling morals that are good and honorable and just and pure in the way that God designed for the family to work, well, this is what you get. A teenage girl, naive if not innocent, unaware of the evil that's out there in the world and that lurks in the heart of every man and woman on earth, as yet free from visible damage due to sin, bearing the image of God in her very being, and an immense intrinsic value to her soul beyond our ability to fully comprehend, holding the severed head of a righteous man as if it's the most normal thing in the world. This is how you get child soldiers. This is how you get child sex trafficking. This is how you get widely accepted pederasty. This is how you get children who rat out their own parents to tyrannical governments. This is how you get a generation that can't figure out whether they're boys or girls, and as a result very often decide the best path forward is suicide. I'm not ready to give up on Salome. I'm not ready to give up on all of the children with similar stories, the adults with similar childhoods, because Jesus hasn't given up on them. Most of them will never repent. Most of them will never seek forgiveness. Most of them will never be granted God's grace. Most of them will never be washed of their sins. Most of them will not seek out the narrow path. But some will. Don't give up on them. Don't stop praying for them. Don't stop encouraging and pleading with them. And maybe, just maybe, you are a Salome. I have unwittingly preached to them before at one church or another. If that is you, please understand, no pit is too deep for Jesus to rescue you. If you feel like you're drowning in your own sin, then I encourage you to let the old you drown and take hold of the hand Jesus is offering you to pull you up out of the water, free from the burden of those sins, cleansed and forgiven, and ready to go about life as a new person, a spiritual person, whose goal is to stay with Jesus forever and bring as many people along with you as you possibly can. We'd love to help at River Ridge. You can reach us at 812-550-6234 or info@riverridgechurch.org, or find us in person at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We gather at 9 a.m. on Sundays for Bible study, 10 a.m. for worship, 4 p.m. for afternoon worship, and 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for another study. I'd love to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.